Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. And welcome to the seminar. Sorry, I'm managing technology here in the background as well, and probably will be for the day. So bear with us, and thanks for joining us. It's great to have you all on board. We are delighted that you're all in attendance, and we actually have just over 800 people registered for today, which I suppose I'm not surprised at, given the issue, but I'm very heartened, I suppose, is the word to use, that we have such an interest in this important topic and in having this conversation that we want to have today. It's a great testament to the speakers that we have on offer today and their work in this area, from research to advocacy to work in the field. And I hope you get a good sense of that really dedicated work and important work that is being carried out in this particular area. Today, the event will be recorded. You will notice that it's already recorded, and we're going to try and make this available in a sort of a manageable format at some point in the near future. And we hope to make it available with some resources as well, including the report that's going to be launched later on today by myself. And we've also invited the speakers from today to share resources if they wish, either in the form of publications or the slides. So we're very conscious you're busy professionals and individuals out there in the audience, and some of you may need to dip in and dip out. So we do want to assure you that this will be recorded and made available, as well as the resources. So I'm delighted to have also my good colleague, Dr. Fikra O'Sullivan here from UCC. Fikra has not only attended the seminar today, but given over his day to help out in the background and to give me a hand as well today. So I'm really grateful for that. And he will be popping in and out as we speak today at various stages. Also, we'll have obviously our keynote address from Professor Ramona Alagia at the University of Toronto. Ramona won't join us until the afternoon, as it's about 4:30 in the morning over in Toronto. So we wouldn't expect that of her, but we're really delighted she can join us today. And her work is some of the seminal foundational work in this area of looking at disclosure of childhood sexual abuse. Our day itself, obviously it's going to run from this morning, 9:30 until 4:30 at the latest, depending on Q&A and how we run on that, but we won't go beyond 4:30. I'm conscious it's Friday as well, and like me, you've probably had a relatively long week. So I want you to enjoy the day, and we will finish on time at 4:30. As I say, it will be split into three main streams, and the first of these is voices from research. And we're delighted to be joined by a selection of researchers in this area, presenting various perspectives and very interesting and useful perspectives on this issue of sexual abuse and disclosure in particular. We had this part of the seminar, we had a call for papers, and we got a really good response for that call for papers, but unfortunately couldn't accommodate everybody, even though there were some excellent papers across the entire cohort. But unfortunately, given this is a day-long seminar and we have other strands as well, we can only accommodate a certain amount. We are, in saying that, really delighted to have the speakers with us this morning in terms of voices from the research, and you will hear from those just after this introduction. We then move on to voices from experience, and we're delighted to be joined by Hazel Catherine Larkin and Mick Finnegan to share their experiences of disclosure and engaging with the system to disclose. And we're going to have some really interesting insights from both of those. And I'm delighted that they're giving over their time to join us here today. Both are strong advocates in this area and strong voices in this area, and much needed voices in this area. So we're delighted that they're sharing their time with us today. Following this, then, we're going to move into what we're calling voices from the field. And this is going to include presentations from Deirdre Kenny, who's the Deputy Director of 1 in 4 and their Advocacy Director, and also Dr. Rosaline McIlvany, who's a clinical psychotherapist from St. Clair's unit. So they're going to very much focus on, I suppose, what it's like in the field, engaging with people who are disclosing. I know Rosaline will talk about some of her research experience around that, and Deirdre will definitely talk about some of her experience with dealing with people on the front line in terms of engagement with the criminal justice system, but also their engagement with 1 in 4, the NGO. All of this is going to be based around a common theme of encouraging, facilitating, and supporting disclosure, and how best we can do that as a society at all levels. And I suppose it's something I see as maybe a starting point for a wider conversation on this area. I was very fortunate. Sorry, I'm getting a message here about the sound. Apologies, just give me 1 second to see if I can rectify that. This is some of the technical glitches we will have. Apologies, everybody, just bear with me. Okay, a lot of people are saying the sound is fine, so it might be technical issues. Apologies. So I suppose the rationale for trying to start this conversation here today is during my own PhD research, I was very fortunate to spend a short time over at McGill University in Montreal. They had conducted a study that was something similar to what I wanted to do here in Ireland, and I went over to essentially learn from how they did that. But while I was there, I was invited to sit in on a wider meeting of a study that was about to commence, a study that actually Ramona was involved in, and also Rosaline. And I remember getting the email about this meeting, and essentially the majority of the authors that I was reading from my research were sitting in on this meeting. So it was a huge opportunity for me, and a huge kind of encouraging boost in terms of my own research. To be sitting in a room with all of these experts in the field, moving this kind of conversation forward. And it sort of made me think, what are we doing here in Ireland? And maybe how can we replicate something like that, of bringing together voices, opinions, and insights on this area of disclosure of sexual abuse, and maybe moving towards creating better environments that do facilitate, encourage, and support disclosure. So we will have some breaks today. I just want to make you aware of those. We'll have a small movement or coffee tea break at about 11:25. My report launch then occurs after that in an individual session, and then we move to a short lunch break at 12:30. And as I say, we'll finish by 4:30. So listen, settle in, grab your coffee or your tea or whatever you wish to do. You can pose questions via the Q&A function, and myself and Fiacre will look after those during the day. And we're delighted to have you on board. And I'm going to move now to introducing our first session, which I'm delighted to say is our research session and our voices from research. This is a session that's going to cover many areas and perspectives on this issue, as I said, and we had, as I said, a strong response for our call for papers, and are delighted with the caliber and quality of the work that's going to be presented here today. I am going to hand over to my good colleague Fiacre now to introduce our first speaker, which will be Dr. Jennifer O'Mahony. I will also give Jennifer a moment to set up her slides and her camera, and you're very welcome. And Fiacre, I'll hand over to yourself to just introduce Jennifer, if that's okay. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Joe. And I'm delighted to chair this session, and also just want to congratulate Joe on setting up an amazing seminar here today with a fantastic panel of speakers. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Jennifer O'Mahony, who is a lecturer in psychology and a chartered member of the Psychological Society of Ireland. She is also co-director of both the Analysing Social Change Research Group and Crime and Justice Research Group at WIT. Jennifer is also a senior researcher at the INSYTE at WIT. Her research focuses on how victimology and trauma are remembered and narrated, the relationship between memory and cultural heritage in digital humanities, and activism and social change. She's the primary investigator of the Waterford Memories Project, which examines historical institutional abuse in Ireland. She is currently a working group leader of the EU Cost Action, Cultures of Victimology, Understanding Processes of Victimization across Europe. So we welcome you, Jennifer, and hand it over to you now, and looking forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here this morning, especially with such wonderful kind of presenters that we're going to be hearing from today. So I'm going to start off talking about the experiences of disclosing historical sexual abuse through the lens of survivors of Ireland's Magdalen laundries, as well as through the lens of both the caring professionals and legal professionals that are also doing this work. I think what we're going to hear emphasize quite a bit today is the need for interdisciplinarity between all of the stakeholders and voices while remaining client-centered and survivor-centered. And we all know that this is best practice, but the reality maybe of what that means and what it looks like is a little bit more difficult to sort of put into place. So the reason I started looking at historical sexual abuse was almost accidental. The campus of the College Street campus of WIT is the former Magdalen Laundry and Industrial School in Waterford. And I had been working in the area of sexual violence for many years. And it was the first time after a couple of years I had been working on the campus that I came across a woman that was a survivor of the Magdalen Laundry, who was just at the age of her mid-70s, finally approaching the Rape Crisis Centre in Waterford to disclose sexual violence that she had experienced as a child, which led essentially to her incarceration in this institutionalized system. And it really got me thinking about the reality of what we mean when we say historical sexual violence, because of course it is never historical. It is never in the past or in history for the survivors. And hence why I have the word historical in quotes here, because I would contest the word really. So just to frame what I'm talking about today in kind of 3 points, and I suppose to frame where I come from with the research that I'm doing in this area. Firstly, I would very, very much support the argument that sexual violence is a human rights issue, that we need to see it as something significantly broader than an individual experience, because if we see it as an individual experience, we expect the individual to cope, to fix whatever may have been done. And that's a completely inappropriate framework to work from. So we have numerous international systemic reviews that report sexual violence as an endemic issue in many countries, to the extent, of course, that we need to see it as a human rights violation. And the second point then, that adult disclosure of childhood sexual abuse has similarly received a lot of attention in the academic literature. And we know very clearly for many years that there are numerous intersecting individual, then more broadly social, and even more broadly again, cultural dimensions that impact disclosure. So we always have to frame the experiences of a survivor within this system of the social life that they are sitting in, as well as the cultural life that they sit within, to really understand their individual experience of disclosure. And the third point is that responding appropriately to sexual violence and disclosure is a constant challenge, not only to health professions, but really we have to look at how do the legal professionals experience taking a case? What are the barriers there? And how do they sit with the barriers identified by the client or the survivor? And then even more broadly, again, our social systems, when we look at how is rape seen, how is disclosure seen within a system of rape culture, and how are we responding to that socially? So this is incredibly complicated. There's so many diverging sort of points, but that doesn't mean we can't come up with a method of doing better and of better supporting both the professionals that of course are affected by disclosure, as well as the survivor, who is the most important person, of course, in any equation. So historical sexual violence in the context of the Magdalen laundries, and the image I'm showing you here is the campus of College Street in WIT. And you can see it's a very, very large campus that encapsulated the industrial school. There was a chapel, the Magdalen Laundry itself, there was a convent, and so on. So it was a very, very large system of institutions that were on site. And looking at the lens of the individual survivor, the social context again of 1960s Ireland, for example, and the cultural dimensions of a Catholic ethos framework gets us much, much closer to really understanding the disclosures if we were to not pay attention to these issues. So for instance, the stigma with being a Magdalen survivor is a major reason why so many women delayed disclosing experiences of child sexual violence, even well into their adult life. And it points again to how horribly effective the stigma of sexual violence was for these women when they were blamed for the experience of child sexual violence, that the perpetrator was not part of the equation. It was the girl or woman's problem. So that tells us a lot more about how that person might be experiencing stigma, blame, negotiating how they can cope with this so-called, again, historical violence. So I'm going to give, just because of time constraints, a really brief example from these three lenses: the survivors, the legal professionals, and the caring professionals that have come through numerous research projects that we've been working on to sort of contribute really a more holistic picture to this issue. So this is a quote from Elizabeth. She was one of the first survivors that I interviewed. Elizabeth has been very, very proactive in activist work and really about drawing attention to what had happened in the Magdalen Laundries and challenging government reports which have really sort of negated the survivor's voice. And she talks here about how when she was a child, she was abused by her stepfather. She disclosed the abuse as a young 5-year-old, and the response essentially was she was removed from the home and placed into an industrial school, and she was later at the age of 12 then sent to a Magdalen Laundry. And it took her a very long time to recognize that the perpetrator, her stepfather, was completely excused, and not only excused, but encouraged to stay within the family unit, while as a very young child, she was removed. And you can imagine the impact of that the disclosure of a violation that had happened to her was met with not only blame, but institutionalization as a punishment for this disclosure. So this incorporates really, this quote, all of those elements of both who is Elizabeth as an individual person and how does she see her experience sitting within that social and cultural context today. And you can see it's anything but historical again in Elizabeth's case. So she is, she spent a very, very long time thinking about what has happened and the impact of what has happened to her. So if we put that into the context then of the legal professionals, we ran interviews with the barristers, solicitors, and other legal professionals who have worked directly with survivors of institutional abuse and asked them about their experiences of the legal system and so forth, and what were their challenges. And these are really the sort of crux issues that, first of all, civil courts are largely unavailable as a method. They are prohibitively expensive. And the case with institutional abuse is often, who do you sue? Do you sue the Irish state? Do you sue the individual perpetrator? Do you sue the Catholic Church? It may be the case that the perpetrator is no longer with us, has passed away, for instance. So a lot of these remedies are simply not available through a legal pathway. Legal aid can, again, be very restrictive with what legal aid will be provided, and particularly for these cases that are complex and quite longitudinal in terms of a court system. This is an issue. There's no cost action legislation in Ireland. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Irish legal system, in comparison to the US, for instance, a cost action would allow a group of survivors to together share the financial burden and so forth, as well as the emotional and cognitive burden of taking a case. But in Ireland, there's no system to allow for this. So it is an individual taking a case every time. A neat persists again to remedy and acknowledge historical abuse through litigation. It's not enough to only target one avenue. There's many survivors who want some version of justice as a result, some recognition of what has happened, which is completely understandable. So when we close off that avenue, it's again a re-traumatization and secondary victimization of what took place. But the statute of limitations is the big one. And again, I think this is going to sound very familiar to many people listening here, that, you know, no matter what, kind of 6 years from the date of the cause of the action accrued is the lengthiest time period under the statute. And this is an enormous issue because child sexual abuse does allow for a sort of an extension up until the person has reached adulthood. But we know that survivors are likely to delay disclosures, that this is quite a common experience. So the legal system doesn't fit with what we know to be a natural process of recovery and coping and so forth, and is extra punitive because of this statute. So this is a quote from one of our interviewees, Andrew, who's a barrister, and he says, the statute of limitations is one of the greatest human rights issues of modern Ireland because it prevents us from dealing with issues of historic abuse. It gives the state and abusers a pass. And when he's talking about the Magdalen Laundry survivors, the state has all its records in its archives. It knows what's happened. So this idea that we're purposely sort of allowing, essentially because of limitations within the legal system, this to slide is really something that needs attention. So again, I would point to, I suppose, the interviewers and interviewees highlighting that even the legal professionals within the system are incredibly frustrated and are burnt out and are angry. That sometimes there's a suggestion that, of course, the system is a problem, but the people within the system aren't necessarily perpetuating it. There are people, thankfully, within the system really fighting against these limitations. So the third angle then is the survey data we collated with caring professionals, so psychologists, social workers, and so forth, about their impressions of past occurrences of violations, trauma, child sexual abuse, as well as how they feel these issues should be dealt with in the present if we have instances of institutional abuse, for instance. So you can see that really when we look at who's responsible for the maltreatment of children, the respondents felt that the facility or the organization is the most responsible, followed then by the individual professionals. But the belief was that the people sort of in charge of the institutions or directing the institutions, the buck stops with them. And these are people currently working within these systems. And they argued this was true for both historical and current abuses. So this highlights the belief that systemic abuses are particularly likely to contribute to a lack of response or prevention of institutional abuse, and that professionals carry most of this responsibility. And corruption in the institution and poor management was mentioned as particularly problematic as well. So if we look at the quote here, this was a senior social worker who said, unfortunately, there's no difference between the abuse that happened then, the abuse that happens now. I have trained hundreds of social care workers, thousands of care workers, and the abuse begins with the system. Every CEO is responsible for the business and how it operates. And there's sort of a trickle effect from there. So it's just to give you a snapshot maybe of the three lenses of people that are maybe surrounding a disclosure process. And of course, this is not limited to these three lenses. There's many other people, families and friends involved in the disclosure process. But our findings with the survivors of the Magdalen Laundries was that the disclosure tended to happen to officials as a result of government responses to the Magdalen Laundries, rather than directly to friends and family, because the women had hid their experience and not disclosed through shame and stigma. So the disclosure process was a little bit different, perhaps. So where my research kind of sits at the moment is I have a very, very strong interest in a field called narrative psychology. And this looks at the psychology behind how we tell our stories of ourselves and our identities. And in particular, experiences of sexual violence will obviously alter that narrative and disrupt it or fragment it. And how do we get to the place of telling a coherent narrative about ourselves? And this has been shown then to be related to better coping, a reduction in negative symptoms, and so forth. So we all do this regardless of trauma experience or not. And autobiographical memory refers to our memory of personal events that have happened to us. So it's highly valued by both ourselves, of course, as a way to structure our world, as well as professionals who work with trauma, because when we disclose trauma, we use words, we use stories to do that. So how that story is told and how it is responded to is, of course, central to disclosure. So this contains knowledge about how we view ourselves and our identity, but really importantly, autobiographical memory is formed through social interaction. So it doesn't happen in our own thoughts in an independent world. It is formed through how we talk to people, how they react to us, how we react to them. So disclosure massively impacts autobiographical memory in the longer term. And it explains how a negative disclosure experience can sit with us for a very, very long time, and how one negative disclosure can feel so much bigger than 10 positive disclosures. So social interactions are absolutely essential to forming how we view ourselves. So if our social interactions are negative, that's going to have an impact. So they serve this uniquely sociocultural function. So culture, social implications, all those things I've mentioned earlier are incorporated into how we view ourselves as well, and how we regulate our emotion. And that's hugely important. When you think of an autobiographical memory and emotional regulation, you may not think those two things go hand in hand, but they're heavily related in terms of psychological processes. But what we get at here is that our reconstructive long-term memory is unique to an individual. So any system or any policy or any approach has to leave scope for individuality. It has to leave scope for a person to sit outside what we typically see, for instance. Otherwise, we are just going to perpetuate a system that is not for everybody. It's for a certain group of people. And that's going to impact how people cope. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want to perpetuate anything negative going forward as professionals in this area. So the second point I've made here, survivors are not a homogenous group, and neither are listeners. And recognizing that and keeping that in mind when we're building systems that are trying to do a one-size-fits-all job is very important, I would argue. So I'm going to conclude really with, I think, again, something that's been stated in the literature for a very long time. It's something I struggle with, that I will look back on papers I've read 20 years ago, and we're not saying a whole lot different in the research. We are definitely moving forward. We definitely have more nuanced understanding, but until from the top down, until our much broader systems take on board tackling rape culture, tackling the entire experience of sexual violence as a human rights issue, we're going to keep saying that we need to incorporate all of these areas, all of these topics. And until it happens, we're not going to progress as fast or as quickly as we really need to. So disclosure is both a distinct individual phenomenon that is specific to that person, their experiences and their individual cognitions, as well as a function of a much more general pattern of human behavior and human cognition that applies to all people. So there's scope to be able to do both, to have a broad level explanation as well as one that can drill down into the individual experience. And this again can relate then to the enhancement or curtailment of disclosure of sexual violence. So an international but highly contextualized research and policy agenda that's open to development, that allows for change, that change is built into the policy. So this multi-level intersectional framework is really what is needed. And I know they've thrown in just a whole lot of terms of talking about intersectional frameworks and so on. But really all I'm getting at is that there is that scope for development and change within any system, and that responds to demands from survivors who at all stages of any process need to be front and centered. Okay, thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks for being so great on your timing as well. You're much better than I am ever, anyway. So thank you so much. And just for all the delegates as well, just to say that we have an open Q&A space for people to type in questions. We're going to kind of keep all the questions that kind of towards the end. And thanks to Lorraine and Michael who have asked questions already. And Jennifer, if you want to have a look at the Q&A and to be answering those questions, but by typing, feel free to do that. And but we'll also have a discussion space at the end. So thanks very much, Jennifer. And I think moving from the experience, let's say, within the Irish context to now explore the experiences of people who have experienced lifetime abuse and are now living in Ireland, is really interesting and timely. So I welcome our next speaker, who is Carol Ballantyne, and who received her PhD from the School of Political Science and Sociology from NUIG Galway in 2020. So Carol, you're very welcome. Prior to that, she spent more than 10 years working in the field of international development, and she works as an independent researcher focusing on gender-based violence, race, and migration. Her two most recent projects were with the UNHCR and the School of Social Policy, Social Work, and Social Justice in UCD. Carol, if you want to start turning on your camera, and you can start to share your screen in the next while. And the title of Carol's presentation is Stigma and Shame in the Disclosure of Lifetime Violence for African Migrant Women in Ireland. And she's going to present that to us today. So Carol, if you are ready, we'd be delighted to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Fiacre. I can now start my video, I hope. And it still says that screen sharing is disabled. So if that could just be enabled.
Perfect.
Oh, there we go. I am the co-host now. Mighty. Okay, can you see my screen?
We can indeed. Thanks a million. Thank
you so much for the invitation. I think my paper today is going to fit quite nicely with Jennifer's fascinating and distressing one, with her call for contextualized information, and also with that overlapping interest in narrative. So what I'm going to present this morning is drawing on a paper that I'm currently preparing to submit to the sociological review. So I've changed the title from what's in our program. I hope you forgive me, but it's just narrowing things in a little. I'm going to need to rush slightly through my definitions and methods so that I have enough time to have a good discussion of the findings. But I'm really open to follow up here in this seminar, and also separately over email or whatever. So this research comes from my PhD, as Fiacre said, and my starting question was, what is the role of intersectional stigma in life experience of violence against women among migrant African women in Ireland? So there's an awful lot in that, so I'm just going to unpack those terms a little. So I started looking at migrant African women in Ireland. Why? I suppose, one, because it's a particularly understudied demographic subgroup. The truth is, all subgroups are understudied, and indeed the topic is understudied in Ireland, so that's quite easy. And my PhD was nested within a wider research project which focused substantively on the continent of Africa. So it was to maintain that connection as well. I'm not going to talk about the power relations in that research relationship, apart from to acknowledge them and to acknowledge my own reflexive practice within carrying out this research. And again, that's something I'm happy to follow up on anytime. So to define violence against women, I used the UN definition from the Declaration for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which as a declaration recognizes in the first instance that this violence is gender-based in nature. And so what Jennifer said previously about it being embedded in a rape culture and in a patriarchal system. It's also a very broad definition, so it incorporates sexual violence, also all types of domestic violence, and a wide range of other types of gender-based violence against women also. And I draw a lot on Professor Liz Kelly's concept of a continuum of violence. So women experience violence not as an either or, yes and no sort of individual instant, but rather as something that occurs within a continuum. So I was particularly interested in how stigma mediates the long-term impacts of violence in people's lives. So I define stigma as a socially labeling process, which is harmful to the individual at individual and in social settings. And more recent scholarship has really highlighted that stigma takes place within power hierarchies and is itself often an exercise of power. I was particularly interested in the fact that violence against women itself is stigmatized, but also recognized that with the community of people that I was doing the research, they confronted a huge range of overlapping and intersecting stigmas. So I couldn't look in isolation at the stigma of violence, but needed to also recognize people's stigmatization and labels according to their race, according to their migration status, or indeed imputed migration status, their reliance on social welfare, their own struggles with mental health, and all of these things drew stigmas at different times and in different places. And the final thing, which isn't in my question or my initial title, which I want to reflect on, is just the idea of shame. So when you look at the violence against women literature, you don't come across stigma so frequently, but the literature is far more revealing on the topic of shame than it is on the topic of stigma. So shame and stigma are different, but they're very closely associated. So shame is a painful social emotion, and it's grounded in a global negative self-assessment. So rather than I did a bad thing, it's the feeling that I am bad. And shame is often produced by stigma, and it is often experienced by people as one of the most insidious and lasting impacts of interpersonal and structural violence against them. I suppose this drew me in particular in the literature as well. Okay, so that's kind of what I was exploring conceptually. And very briefly then, this is how I went about it. So I've recently published a paper in Violence Against Women Journal on my methods. So I'm going to summarize them really quickly here. So I'm talking about 6 participatory focus group discussions, which I carried out with African women living in Ireland in small groups where there was a lot of trust, so where people already knew each other. And these were really to establish norms and attitudes around violence. So people were specifically asked not to reflect on their own personal experiences. We used vignettes and imagined stories. And drawing from those focus group discussions, then I conducted individual interviews with victims and survivors who spoke about their own personal experiences of violence. So looking at those two things together allowed me to understand individual experiences in quite a rich social context. Okay, so what I found in terms of the strategies that people used long after, so while they were experiencing violence and long after they considered the violence to be over, was 4 main strategies that people drew on. The first was to maintain appearances, to appear to be happy, to appear even to be thriving. And so individuals who had themselves survived both domestic violence and conflict-related violence spoke a lot about needing to be seen, to be successful and to be happy and not have problems. That involved navigating relationships very, very carefully. And people were highly conscious of how they would be heard and how they would be perceived in different social groupings. So that involved often navigating patriarchy in heritage communities. One interview participant described how you have to kick the Nigerians away. So to escape that judgment of her as a single mother, as a divorcee, as a survivor of violence, and then navigating racism and other sorts of patriarchal judgments in mainstream society. So really, really careful relationship management. And this also involved really, really careful management of telling and management of one's own story. So it's not as simple as self-silencing as such. It was much more strategic silences and strategic telling. And interviewees described to me how they held back from disclosing their own experience to people who disclosed to them in a self-protective way. And all of this was underpinned by a huge amount of work on self-care. And all of these strategies were encapsulated and explained in a really strong collective narrative identity that I perceived across focus groups and interviews, and which is well documented elsewhere. And that's this identity of the strong Black woman. And the strong Black woman is resilient, stoical, uncomplaining, and thriving. So individual participants drew on this identity in a very, very positive way. So this is Sade, who survived domestic violence, both in Ireland and Nigeria. And she says, we just keep putting our best foot forward. That's what we do, really. So a really strong personal identification with this trope. And it was also really strongly supported in focus groups by people who were talking about violence much more in the theoretical. So I could see ways in which the community supported each other to sustain this narrative identity of strength, resilience, and non-complaining. And a key part of that really was non-speaking, was self-silencing. Actually, just going back to that previous slide, a lot of this analysis really, really resonated with this book by Eva Kagneredzi, which was published in 2018. And she conducted a similar study in the UK, drawing strongly on critical race theory and on research around kind of controlling images and narrative identities in the US. So I really, really recommend that analysis. So what are the implications of all of this? I suppose in the first instance, obviously, this narrative identity does inhibit disclosure, and it does result in levels of psychological distress from not being able to tell. And crucially for me as a sociologist, it sustains and reinforces the norms that normalize violence, normalize accepting violence within society. But one thing that really surprised me in the interviews and focus group discussions I conducted was that I didn't hear the levels of debilitating shame and self-effacement that I came to expect from the literature. And so again, I saw this in wider literature. There is something in that robust protective identity that also served to protect the individuals from the worst excesses of shame. So what are the implications of all of this? I suppose in the first instance, this was a really, really empowering, resonant and strong identity narrative that was shared across a small group that I conducted research with. And I think that requires respect at the same time as we need to acknowledge that self-silencing is really, really harmful and difficult. And that means that the space for change needs to happen, I believe, is in the way that those narratives develop and the availability, perhaps, of alternative narratives. And perhaps that can be carried out at a community level at the same time as at a wider social level. We continue to address the structural nature of stigma and stigmatization. Apologies for rushing that terribly, but I got through it in 15 minutes. So thank you very much, and questions are welcome.
Carl, thank you very much. I think I was really stimulated by that notion of self-silencing and how individuals can self-silence, how communities can self-silence, and how states and state responses can be self-silencing. So I think there's a resonance between your presentation and Jennifer's beforehand. So thank you so much. Shortly, we're going to be moving on to the next speaker, but just before that, I just wanted to explain to everyone that we have closed off the chat function because some of the questions delegates were putting into the chat function, and we've opened the Q&A section for everyone so that questions can be put up there. And it's great to see that that delegates have continued to being asked to ask questions for Jennifer in that. And again, for any questions for Carl, please feel free to put those into the Q&A session. So we're bang on time. We're doing really well, which is surprising when I'm the person that's chairing. But we're going to move to our next speaker now, Neha Kamrani, who is going to be talking about body and memory and looking at a comparative study of adult disclosures of rape and child sexual abuse in Deirdre Kinahan's Rathmines Road and Dina Mehta's Getting Away with Murder. So Neha is currently researching for her doctoral thesis on representations of sexual violence in contemporary Irish and Indian theatre in UCD. She is also a research fellow for Media Action Against Rape, a UNESCO-funded project that's looking at a rape reportage in India, and has served as its project manager at UNESCO's New Delhi cluster office. Her MPhil thesis, New Rape Narratives in the Indian Public Sphere, is an academic intervention against sexual assaults, as she works on fictional and non-fictional rape narratives, uttered via new media forms such as photographs, documentaries, and blog posts. She completed her bachelor's degree in English literature from Delhi University, following which she went on to pursue her master's in MPhil at Jawaharlal Nehru University. In India, she worked as an assistant professor at Delhi University and Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. She continues to work with various Indian NGOs to contribute towards the well-being of the girl child in India. So Neha, you're really welcome. We're really looking forward to your presentation, which I think brings us into another sphere around narratives and how the ubiquitous nature of violence against women and children across literature and in all spheres of society. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Is my slide visible to everyone? Can everyone see the slideshow?
But it hasn't gone into slideshow quite yet.
Okay, all right. Now?
Perfect. Thanks.
Great. Okay. So I'm presenting on body and memory through two plays here, Deirdre Kinahan's Rathmines Road and Dina Mehta's Getting Away with Murder. But I just want to mention that this is basically a small section from the larger research, which is basically working on representing sexual violence on contemporary Irish and Indian stage. And so my reasons for comparing Irish and Indian stage are kind of more detailed there rather, and I wouldn't really be getting into them in this presentation. First performed almost 2 decades apart from each other, both Rathmines Road and Dina Mehta's Getting Away with Murder recount instances of child and teen sexual abuse that happened between 1970s and 1980s. So through the study of these two plays about retrospective disclosures of sexual violence in India and Ireland, this presentation analyzes the long-term effects of rape and sexual violence on mind and body, and the challenge of memory in retrospective disclosures. So finally, it also identifies multiple barriers that are prolonged and are signified by the silence of the rape survivors. So Rathmines Road by Kinahan is about Sandra, who has returned to Wicklow after nearly 25 years with her husband Ray, only to sell off her inherited property. As with most homecomings, she meets her long-forgotten friends and deals with the familiar but altered surroundings. Sandra is visited by a school friend, David, now transitioned to Darna, and a former acquaintance, Linda. Linda is also a realtor who will help Sandra in selling her house, and she visits Sandra with her husband, Eddie. Sandra immediately identifies Eddie as one of her rapists and imagines how to confront him about the rape. So in 2 acts, the play imagines the hardships that Sandra and her family may face if she disclosed her rape and the rapist. Dina Mehta's Getting Away with Murder is about 3 friends, Sonali, Malika, and Razia. So in 2 acts, the play encompasses a wide range of women's issues in India, such as sexual harassment, female infanticide, gender-based workplace harassment, child sexual abuse, witch hunting, and several others. So the overarching action of the play is based on Sonali's decision to abort her child because she fears it is a girl. While the morality behind such a decision is questioned by Sonali's friends, and it is revealed that Sonali is a survivor of child sexual abuse and was sexually abused by her uncle from age of 8 to 12. As the play progresses, Gopal, who's Sonali's brother, his complicity with the uncle's murder is revealed, as is the source of Sonali's hallucinations. So the play ends with Sonali having decided against the abortion, but most of the other issues in the women's lives remain unresolved. So while studying these 2 plays together, it needs to be stated that both the plays deal with differing instances of sexual violence. While Getting Away is an account of a child survivor of sexual abuse and her inability to articulate or remember the abuse, Rathmines Road is a narrative of a teen gang rape survivor who grapples with her memory and is afraid to complicate her life by disclosing the sexual violence she had suffered. In Rathmines Road, the challenges faced by Sandra are more outward than inward, as she faces hostile friends and family. But in Sonali's case, the challenges are more psychological. So despite these clear differences, the 2 plays highlight different ways in which post-traumatic stress affects the survivors of sexual violence, both child or teen, and the complicated nature of retrospective disclosures in contemporary Indian and Irish society. So Simon McCarthy-Jones in Violence Against Women notes that long-term effects of non-consensual experiences of sexual intercourse in women have been severely understudied, arguing that women who have experienced forced or persuaded sex at a young age were more susceptible to worse physical and psychological health. The issues are prominent within both the plays. So the instances are more pronounced in getting away, and they're evident from the first scene onwards. Sonali complains of a recurrent headache, insists on smoking while being pregnant, and hysterically claims that she can hear her dead mother's voice and see her in her bedroom mirror. The audience initially reads Sonali's absurd claims as her way of expressing the anxiety of being pregnant, possibly with an unwanted girl child, but the reasons are more convoluted. As the play progresses, we witness Sonali's psychosis as she tries to make associations and sense of what happened to her through her repressed memories. The hints of sexual abuse Sonali suffered as a child resurface as she associates her mother-in-law's constant prying with her uncle's abusive behavior. She shouts at the end of scene 3, "You have no other work, old woman, but to peep at me like him. Every time I took a bath, I could hear him outside, breathing, waiting to look at me without my clothes on." In Rathmines Roads too, we see Sandra crying and shouting affirmations in the first scene. As the scene progresses, Sandra suffers from breathlessness, fear, and confusion. She has a panic attack in the first scene, and it is suggested that this is not the first time. Despite exhibiting most symptoms of PTSD so far, the audience and her friends still read these physical manifestations as Sandra's confusion at having to sell her house, a dear possession in her family that has been there for generations, until she utters, "Fuck you, Eddie Dunn," and suddenly muffles her mouth to stop herself from speaking up. So both Sandra and Sonali build up scenarios in their heads, try to recount past memories, and in the process, hear voices from the past and are unable to interact properly in their present-day realities. McCarthy-Jones also noted that there is enough medical evidence to support that suffering child or teen abuse is associated with increased probability of developing experience of hearing voices, formerly termed as auditory verbal hallucinations. So from scene 3 onwards in Getting Away, we see very clear signs of ADH in Sonali, where she begins to speak in a petulant 8-year-old voice as she regresses in time. Sonali, in her hallucination, tries to tell her mother that she dislikes sitting next to her uncle and his fingers hurt her when he tickles her. So in the play, rather than admitting Sonali to an institution because she exhibits clear signs of mental breakdown, her family and friends come together to support her and understand the reasons behind her behavior. In Rathmines Road, we see Sandra crumble into her own world where she's imagining scenarios about her disclosure of rape. So the entire scene 2 and 3 are an extension of Sandra's auditory verbal hallucinations. Panic attacks and ADH are not the only symptoms that Sandra exhibits. She also claims that she has had several dreams about her rapists. However, in recalling the past and calling out her abuser, unlike Sonali, Sandra gets very little support from her friends and family, and also has an unsupportive husband. Then about how is all of this represented on stage? Lisa Fitzpatrick argues that the idea of narrating the rape in survivor's voice and not exhibiting on stage ensures that the audience are never allowed unmediated access to it, and their awareness of women's subjective response is maintained. So in highlighting this style of representation, Fitzpatrick argues that consensual sex and rape may look alike on stage, and consent or the lack of thereof is not necessarily visually or mimetically representable. So this ambiguity in consent and the lack of its clarity through visual representation perhaps informs Kinahan and Mehta's decision to use verbal representation. Without enacting the rape on stage, both playwrights explore the extra pressures on women who have little proof for their case and their rape narratives, and are entirely based on their oral or their family's oral testimonies. So in Rathmines Road, the entire account is narrated in Sandra's voice as we see her here center stage. It is her perception of the event that audience hears. So despite not being in control of the reaction and opposition from other characters, she's in complete control of her narrative. For instance, the audience can only see Sandra as the other characters are in darkness, but they can be heard cross-questioning her narrative. With this strategy of dialogue delivery and spotlights on the survivor, the challenge of credibility in retrospective disclosures is made even more stark for the audience. In Getting Away, this narrativizing is not done solely by Sonali, as she's helped throughout by her brother Gopal. By highlighting the need for a multivocal narrative, Mehta highlights the difficulty of articulating rape for a survivor of child sexual abuse and the absence of effective vocabulary. So the disclosure in the play does not come directly from Sonali. Although Sonali is not in complete control of her narrative, as Sandra is, both plays give equal importance to verbal testimony over visual proof. Further, Gopal in the play serves as an active bystander for Sonali, providing credibility to her harrowing memories and giving words to her experiences. As a 12-year-old survivor of sexual abuse, Sonali then lacked the vocabulary to describe her experience and could only understand it as being hurtful, fearful, and unpleasant. Instead, it is Gopal who constructs the narrative for the audience and provides the vocabulary for the rape. And he says, night after night, coming to her bed, the pious swine with sandalwood paste on his forehead and holy beads around his neck. The function of memory in both the plays is distorted because although it is used to reconstruct the past, its accuracy is always uncertain. As Sandra repeats the details of her rape multiple times on stage, it becomes apparent for the audience that Sandra's memory is blurry, and it's difficult to take everything that she says at face value. When asked about the incident and if hospital would have her medical records, she gives a vague response of no, yes, maybe. Sandra's response encapsulates the difficulties of building a case of retrospective disclosure of sexual abuse as memory becomes unreliable and medical proof is scant. This section talks about this prolonged silence and different barriers that prolong the silence even more. So in the attempt to re-theorize rape and study silence as a language like any other, Z.B. Thompson and Serge Chagrin describe Schland's stance that silence is not a semantic void. Silence can be oppressive, and yet, as Schland emphasizes, like any language, it's infused with narrative strategies that carry ideologies and reveal unstated assumptions. So silence can be read as a choice, a necessity, or a refusal to face repercussions of disclosure. Sonali and Sandra's silence for nearly 2 decades, and the silence of most sexual violence survivors who give retrospective disclosures or totally avoid disclosures is reflective of Schland's stance. In the context of Rathmines Road and Getting Away, instead of reading this silence as another tool for victim blaming, it can be read as a reflection on either a survivor's choice or their hesitation to face legal and emotional trauma that follows disclosures. Thus, staying silent can be read as a survival tactic for rape survivors. In such a reading, years of silence along with final disclosure become a complete rape narrative, where silence holds as much meaning and narrates the survivor's experience as does the verbal narrative. In a joint study by Delphine Vezina based on Ramona Elegia's an ecological analysis of child sexual abuse disclosure, several barriers to adult disclosures were identified. And these included barriers from within, barriers in relation to others, and barriers in relation to the social world. Rathmines and Getting Away exhibit several instances of these barriers and reveal why Sandra and Sonali took more than 2 decades to disclose the abuse they suffered. So despite the societal assumption that it is in the best interest of the survivors and society to talk about child sexual abuse as it may lead to successful legal interventions and prosecutions. The plays actually document several negative impacts of disclosure. In Getting Away, for instance, Sonali's retrospective disclosure is further delayed because of the fear that it can have a far-reaching effect on herself and her family. Her plan to defend herself against the uncle can be possibly charged as voluntary manslaughter. And other than this, reporting the rape and its effects on Sonali's psyche will also reveal the incident of female infanticide, as her first miscarriage may well have been a deliberate one, prompted by her reluctance to give birth to a daughter who may suffer from similar victimization. Yeah, I'm just concluding.
1 minute. Yeah,
Okay.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much.
I'm just concluding, last paragraph here. So finally, Rathmines Road and Getting Away in their plots and future course of action for their protagonists discuss only the barriers to disclosure of adult sexual abuse, whereas there's no mention or scope of legal process to initiate justice. This is so because in both the plays, legal trial is not even shown as an option, because reporting retrospective abuse itself remains a challenge enough for the survivors in India and Ireland. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Neha, and it's fascinating and invigorating to see how you can highlight issues that arrive or highlight issues within novels that are so embedded into the lived realities for children, girls, women across the globe. And thank you very much. Again, we'll into the Q&A, people can put questions and we will have a discussion at the end. So thank you very much. Also, just to say that in the chat and in some of the questions, delegates have been asking about the slides and whether they will be available afterwards. With presenters and speakers today's permission, Joe intends to put some of the presentations on his Irish social work blog to hold them there as a repository so that people can have access to them afterwards and in a sustainable way. And again, just a question that came up earlier was just in relation to CPD certificates. There will be a certificate of attendance available, but it's not formally a CPD. It's not an accredited CPD, but there's a certificate of attendance available to delegates as necessary. So thanks very much, and thanks for to the 3 speakers so far. My head is buzzing with questions and thoughts, and I'm kind of tweeting about those as well. So feel free to tweet everybody as well. And we're now going to move on to the next speaker, Dr. Michelle Walsh, who is the project lead on the Clinical Innovation Project at the Rape Crisis Networks of Ireland. She completed her PhD in the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre in NUIG, where she undertook a nationwide study which looked at the effects and understanding of sexual harassment among the Irish adolescent population. She has worked as an extern on the Real You project for several years, delivering the training on the module on sex and the law, in addition to delivering training on sexual violence and consent to a wide variety of audiences in the last number of years. Michelle also works for the Rape Crisis Midwest as a counsellor trainer, and former board member. She's aware of the many issues faced by clinicians who work with survivors who have also experienced sexual violence. She is knowledgeable and passionate about sexual, domestic, and gender-based violence. And today's presentation, an exploration of sexual harassment among Irish adolescents, their experiences and understanding, is a testament to that knowledge. So you're very welcome, Michelle, and we look forward to hearing from you. So you might unmute yourself if that's possible.
I think I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
You are indeed. I can hear you now. Thanks very much. And I will be quiet now.
And I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Just give me 2 seconds. Thank you. Can everybody see that okay? I'm assuming.
Absolutely, Michelle.
So I'm going to present to you today the findings of my PhD study, which was an exploration of sexual harassment among adolescents, Irish adolescents, over a 12-month period. We published a report from the PhD back in July, and we entitled it Storm and Stress. It's that period in adolescence named by Coleman. But I suppose for me, I would really agree with one of the earlier speakers, Jennifer, that sexual violence is a human rights issue, and we need to look at it in the broader context. We can't look at it at an individual level if we hope to make any impact into addressing the issues that arise from this. And I feel that not acknowledging what's happening among our adolescents is silencing them. It's preventing them from making timely disclosures and getting the help that they need. So I suppose for me, it very much feeds into that retrospective disclosure. If we were doing more and acknowledging more among our young people, would we be aiding them in not having to wait until they're adults to disclose? So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little video. So this is a poem from an adolescent survivor that I got when I was collecting data last year. And I think it's very, very important to just remember, you know, as we talk today about the effects of disclosure and sexual violence, that behind every one of these statistics that we show, that there is actually a person. So I'm just going to put this on for you, and then we'll talk through the findings of the study.
I was sexually assaulted when I was 6 years old. Until very recently, I thought nothing of it. Everyone has a weird cousin, right? Crazy inside jokes just between you guys as a family. It happens, everyone. Who was I to know that my experiences were anything more than that? Every secret meeting was backed up with giggles and jokes, touches were tickles, and we were the best of friends. He made me feel special and like I was the best little girl in the world, and I cherished that feeling. I've spent the last decade searching for that feeling, begging to feel wanted, through self-harm, through binge eating, through sex. Yet here we are, basking in an emptiness I've come to accept as a reality. I can remember so vividly the encounters I had with him. Let's go play a game behind the turf shed. So, like a dog, I patted obediently behind him, giggling. I was his favourite, you see, and that's all that mattered. My experience with sexual abuse is something I'm still only coming to terms with, something I want to brush under the rug and forget about again, but I can't. Sexual assault isn't always just touching. It's a memory, a psychological mark that is relentless in its presence. A strange thing I've noticed about myself over the last week or so is how I was so unaware until I wasn't anymore. He never left a mark on my body, he only scarred my mind. It's like I always thought that this scar was a birthmark, and now I can't look at it the same way, and I never will. We all go on a journey of self-acceptance. For some, a brisk stroll through a park, occasionally tarnished by thorns. For others, a boat ride through a storm, each wave of emotion crashing through you on what seems like a never-ending quest for stability. But we all get there in the end. Though each journey is unique, each struggle is different, and each person shrouded in loneliness, none of us are alone. It is not a battle of whose journey is hardest, not a competition of whose scars run deeper, or whose sky has the most clouds. It is instead a relentless fight against a common enemy, a revolution against the abuse and the people who take advantage of the children they are trusted with. We as youth are not looking for your sympathy, but instead empathy. Do not pity the child who has grown up with thick skin, but instead help her ensure no other child will be forced to grow up too fast the way she was forced to. The Native American proverb states, "We do not inherit our earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." Let us make a world we are proud to hand over, a world they will not want to give back.
So, I suppose moving on from that, I took a critical realist approach to the research that I conducted. I had 599, just shy of 600 adolescents. I developed a questionnaire for them, and I interviewed another 125, and I also interviewed the youth workers for their experiences of sexual harassment, both themselves and with the adolescents that they were working with. And I suppose anecdotally, working as a therapist for the last 10 years and a clinical supervisor, I knew that sexual harassment among adolescents was happening, but I wanted to quantify it. So these are the findings. So 59% of the adolescents were female, and then we had 41 that were male. And I suppose to be able to compare them, I divided them into two different age groups: the younger adolescents, which were the 13 to 15, and the older adolescents, which were 16 and 17-year-olds. And we had a total of 13% of LGBTQ adolescents within the study. So with the youth workers, again, 67% were female, 33 were male, and they ranged from 22 to 61 years of age. And 76% of them were between 20 and 40. I think they had a combined 101 years of experience between them, working experience. And again, the majority was straight. And then we had a small percentage, 9.5%, that were from the LGBT community. So for me, it's very, very difficult to look at sexual harassment as a standalone concept. It has a massive relationship to social norms, and that also feeds into policy and practice. And I suppose looking at sexual harassment as something that exists on a continuum, all adolescent violence starts somewhere. Nobody just wakes up in the morning and decides to be sexually violent or violent in any other way. It starts with milder forms of harassment before progressing to more serious forms of behaviour. And I think it's only by understanding that we can properly address this from a bottom-up and top-down approach. So for the study, I had to obviously quantify sexual harassment and what it was. There is such a broad spectrum of behaviours that are included in sexual violence, and that can obviously negatively impact on a person. So for me, within the context of the study, sexual harassment is unwanted sexual, verbal, non-verbal behaviours which draw on gender-based beliefs and sexist hostility. It can range from unwanted banter, jokes, comments, gestures, and unwanted sexual advances to unwelcome or uninvited sexual contact. Within the context of this report, that means acts up to and including rape. This is a behaviour which violates the person's dignity and creates intimidating, hostile, degrading, and offensive environment. Now, again, within the study, we set out to examine sexual harassment, the milder forms of sexual harassment. But participants within the study reported experiences of sexual abuse, and in some instances rape, that went well beyond the milder forms of harassment. And I thought it was very, very important to acknowledge and listen to that, and to report on it within the context of the study. Why is it important? So the impact of sexual harassment among adolescents, and I suppose within the adult population as well, is something that we work with within RCNI on a daily basis. And adolescence is such a transitional time on its own that the effects of sexual harassment really can create some life-altering challenges and changes for the adolescent. You know, and you can see there from the slide some of the problems that result from adolescent sexual harassment that were reported within the study, and also that we see and work with on a daily basis. You know, we're talking about academic underperformance, socializing, eating problems, engaging in school, really life-altering consequences. So I suppose I looked at, why do adolescents perpetrate sexual harassment? And as I said, they're normally some sort of a continuum of behaviours that develop in early childhood. And it's as a result of a number of interrelated and interdependent factors. So I looked at the individual skills, values, and psychological traits that contribute to sexual harassment, or to an individual perpetrating sexual harassment. And the most important ones that came to light from the study were the gender expectations, the personality and characteristic traits of the individual, the personal values, again, which are influenced by the home, knowledge and moral reasoning, self-efficacy, self-esteem, and emotional regulation. And then I looked at what are the environmental processes and the social predictors of sexual harassment. And again, we found gender norms, parenting, siblings, family dynamics, and peer relationships, popularity among school groups, school in itself, the social background of the individuals, the culture, the media that they were exposed to, and the clubs and groups that they engaged with. So I asked adolescents firstly, where do they feel that most sexual harassment happened? And not surprisingly, in today's world, 42% of adolescents felt that most sexual harassment happens online. And then we had 4% that were telling us they were experiencing sexual harassment within the home. 23% said that most sexual harassment happens when they're out with their friends, and another 12% said that it happens in schools. Surprisingly, when you think that these adolescents were between 13 and 17, pubs and clubs was 10% of the response. And 6% said others, and when they said other, they meant places like out in the park, walking down the street. And I suppose it's also very important to remember in the context of this, that adolescents spend an awful lot of time in school with their friends and online at the same time in a lot of circumstances. So some of these figures can be merged in that way. So the levels of sexual harassment experienced by adolescents over a 12-month period. So we measured that on a continuum. So we had 20% of adolescents that said that they experienced no sexual harassment. And the other 80%, as you can see, did not fare so well. So I asked them about the sexual comments and jokes, the milder forms of sexual harassment that they did not want to be exposed to. And 30% said that they had experienced this. I again asked then about moderate sexual harassment. So in this context, that was sexting, seeing images, or being sent them that they did not want to see. And we have 26% of adolescents who experienced this. And then I asked about physical behaviors, the more serious forms of sexual harassment, including sexual advances, touches, and various forms of sexual assault. And again, we have 20% of adolescents that have experienced this. And then the extreme forms of sexual harassment, 3% of the adolescents in the study actually experienced rape. So quite startling figures. So the second graph here shows the levels of sexual harassment witnessed by adolescents. And again, this was over a 12-month period, an experience that they did not want to be exposed to. The figures drop here a little bit, as in only 17% of adolescents felt that they had not witnessed any sexual harassment. At the milder forms, we were 24%. The moderate forms of sexual harassment, sexting, seeing images and being sent them that they didn't want to see, we were up at 30%. And the physical serious forms of sexual harassment, 23% of adolescents said that they had witnessed that, and 5% said that they had actually witnessed rape and extreme forms of sexual harassment. So I looked at the adolescents by age. So older adolescents, the 16 to 17 group, were 2.71 times more likely to report that they'd been forced to do something sexual against their will in comparison to younger adolescents. Older adolescents were also 1.83 times more likely to experience inappropriate, non-consensual touch in comparison to the younger group. And older adolescents were nearly 2 times more likely than younger adolescents to agree that sexual harassment happened within their peer community. And again, there, if you just look at, some of the comments that I got from some of the adolescents really, really made me think, and they were quite startling. It's just the way it is. Like, you could be standing talking to your friends and some guy will grab you or whatever. Like, you just have to push them off. So it's kind of accepted. That's what boys do. It's hard because no one's going to do anything. It happens to everyone at least once. So then I looked at gender and what impact did gender have on the issue of sexual. Yes.
Can I give you 1 more minute, if that's all right?
So girls are obviously subjected to much higher levels of sexual harassment than boys. And again, possibly just in the interest of speed, I'm just going to whiz through these slides and you'll be able to get the information from the slides afterwards. But again, it's a major issue. And sexuality is also a major issue. The LGBT community are far more likely to experience sexual harassment than their heterosexual counterparts. And that's just a brief overview of what is in the slides, a summary. And I suppose it's very important also to remember that 100% of the youth workers within this study all reported experiencing sexual harassment while at work. And that's quite shocking also. So what I did was I created an ecological framework for both understanding and responding to sexual harassment. So the framework, I'm just flashing it through there for you, but I think we need to work at each level of the ecological system to understand and hopefully then make some intergenerational changes. And the second part of the framework looks basically at what we need to do, the recommendations for responding to sexual harassment at each level of the ecological framework to try and make some difference and some impact on the issue of adolescent sexual harassment. So there we go.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm sorry to have to cut you off. I was deep in thought and then forgot to look at the clock myself. And hopefully we'll be able to get back to that systemic approach there that you just talked about. It was really fascinating. I'm currently involved in some research around positive masculinities and around kind of working on men around anti-violence against women. And as a part of that is the very similar kind of findings coming across here in Ireland, in Sweden, Israel and Spain, very similar to yours. And what struck me, what always strikes me is like that the pervasive everyday nature of harassment, particularly of young women and girls. And what strikes me is one comment by a participant in our research when we asked her what could we do, what could we do as the grown-ups for young people, and her response was teach girls self-defense. It was, and that was nearly more depressing for me because it was, well, what about the boys? So thank you so much. And I was also struck with your presentation with that poem, and I know it's come up in the Q&A, your poem and Neha's examination of the of English of literature, that it strikes me, you know, in our work, in my work, we talk about kind of entry points to learning and understanding, and how poetry and literature can illuminate understanding. And Anne and Geraldine in the Q&As have mentioned that. So thank you both again. We're just coming up to our final speaker before the question and answers kind of panel discussions. And there's lots of questions there. So I'd like to introduce Marilyn Rome. I hope I have got your name right.
You did.
Perfect. Who is a counsellor at Cork Counselling Services with a Master's in Clinical Psychology and a BSc in Counselling and Psychotherapy, who is also a professional mediator and coach. Marilyn is passionate about bringing innovation to the world of mental health, and draws today on 25 years of professional experience in strategy and change management, and in her work as a therapist by using humanistic integrative approaches. She's non-diagnostic and person-centered in her work, and her clients ask her for support with a wide range of themes, including trauma, abuse, crisis intervention, identity, shame, depression, anxiety, grief, and anger. Today's presentation from Marilyn is titled Traumatic Repeat or Healing Environment, Ethical Dilemmas of Mandatory Historical Reporting. And I think that's very timely. It's timely for me as a social worker educator, Marilyn, because I've just visited students on placement, and they talked about learning now in being in placement in different settings, and having to engage with this concept of mandatory reporting of historical or retrospective disclosures of childhood abuse. And I think coming to understand it and the nature of it is very helpful to us. So thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Figra, for your introduction. Yes, as you said, my name is Marilyn. I'm a counsellor at Cork Counselling Services. I can't see myself. Can people see me? I can see Figra's screen. Can you all see me, Figra?
You might need to adjust your top right-hand corner, Marilyn.
Okay, as long as you can see me, then that's fine.
I can see you anyway. Hopefully the audience can see you also.
Okay, very good. Yes, so I'm a counsellor at Cork Counselling Services. We're a counselling centre and also a training institute, and now emerging as a research institute as well. What I should say as well is the reason I'm here is that we recently published our research about mandatory historical reporting that was published in the Irish Journal for Counselling and Psychotherapy, and I will make it available through the conference. And then I became personally interested in this subject because I had to report historical abuse that I witnessed when I was a child. Now, for me, that the abuser didn't live in Ireland, so that meant that my counsellor wasn't mandated to report. And for me, what that did is it gave me a sense of agency, because I could decide the pace and the way in which I wanted to report. And looking back, for me, it was a healing experience. But I also know through my work that for many people, it's not. It's a traumatizing experience. And what I'm interested in is the ethical dilemma, because we all want to root out this culture of sexual abuse. But what if our client gets harmed in the process? And that's really what I think a lot of people struggle with in our professions, and what I'd like to talk a bit more about today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Now, to stay within the time boundary, I will focus on the findings of this research, but again, the literature review and the method and the references will all be available in the paper. Now, the thing that I do want to remind ourselves of is what exactly the mandate is of historical abuse. And these are different sources collated together. So in the Children First Act, it says that if you receive a disclosure from a client that they were abused as a child, you should report this information to TUSLA. Then the Irish statute book specified that we need to disclose that information as soon as it is practicable. And then in the TUSLA guidance notes to retrospective abuse, you read that a report needs to be made where there may be a current or potential risk to children. Now, the other thing that I'll very briefly cover is a summary of the method of this research. It was a qualitative research. We interviewed 5 humanistic integrative counsellors who are also experienced supervisors. So the participants could draw from their own experience as therapists as well as their work with supervisees. I did semi-structured interviews, then transcribed them and analysed them using a thematic analysis. And throughout, the study was ethically scrutinised. I'm a member of the IACP and I adhere to their code of ethics. So let's have a look at the research story. When we do research, I always think it's a good sign if there's at least one finding that you didn't expect, because it means that we learned something new. And for me, that finding I didn't expect came when I asked the question, what if historical reporting was no longer mandatory? How would that be? And I suppose I expected a sense of relief, but that's not what I heard. The participants, and by the way, you see names with the quotes, they are all pseudonyms that the participants chose for themselves. What they said is, no, that wouldn't be a good idea because the nettle needs to be grasped. It is really good that the abuse is taken seriously because Children First moves us in the direction of health for society. And then Advocate talked about how her beliefs developed over time. First, she said mandatory reporting was a pain in the ass. But then through conversations with her supervisor, she became more aware of the culture that's complicit with sexual abuse and the need for therapists to not collude with a secrecy that's unhealthy. Now, just because these participants were supportive of mandatory historical reporting didn't mean that they were comfortable with it. When I asked how counsellors felt when their client disclosed historical abuse, the majority used the word panic. It catches your breath. Oh my God, where is this landing me now? And they talked about their work with their supervisees who worry about getting into trouble and they go straight to reporting. So that was interesting. So then we unpacked the panic a little bit more. And what we found is that it was rooted in 2 things. It was rooted in the division between therapy and the law, and also in negative experiences with the reporting system. So let's have a look at each of them. Starting with therapy and the law, because they were described as poles apart. They mix like oil and water. And what happens when the law enters the counselling room is it's like working to the beat of somebody else's drum. And then there is an additional dilemma that comes up, which is in one way, counsellors want to work with their clients until they are ready to report historical abuse. And TUSLA gives us the freedom to do so. But then there's also the Irish statute book that says that the offence needs to be reported as soon as it's practicable. And what happens to counsellors in that is it makes us feel vulnerable. It makes us feel like we're taking a legal risk if we want to do right by our clients. And this account from Petra illustrates that, that vulnerability. What Petra says is, I made a report in 3 months. It felt a little uncomfortable in terms of mandatory. And it was necessary because in the end, the client was able to stay with the fallout. So you see the vulnerability in that. Yeah. Now, the other reason for the panic was that counsellors experiences that too many of their clients get damaged in the process. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read out the quotes here. Advocate said, the guards did not handle my information confidentially, and people in my community are now aware that I reported this, or the DPP will not prosecute, or it has been 6 months and I have not heard from anyone. And then Bodicea adds to that, is reporting in the interest of the client, given nowadays the HSE believes that it has to inform the abuser immediately that an allegation has been made against them. And then advocate concludes, to put the legislation in place but not the supports is a setup for another layer of abuse. So that's not good, and none of us want this. So let's have a look at what's to be done about it. Now, the section about ideas for improvement were really about what counsellors could do to help improve the system. And the first suggestion that came to me was that as counsellors, we need to turn up and take our seat at the multidisciplinary table. Because according to participants, we lack confidence, we lack professional confidence, we don't like picking up the phone to other professionals. And that's a shame, because if we look at the Savvy report, we see that clients mostly disclose to counsellors, and also counsellors deliver the most positive experiences compared to the Gardaí and medical professionals. So in that respect, we could say, well, actually, counsellors, we have a responsibility to take our seat and to engage with the system and to address what's not working. And then I asked, okay, so if we were to take our seat at the table, what would we bring as counsellors? And the answer to that was that maybe we can contribute to changing how clients are met across the journey. Because as advocate said, that is the difference between another abusive, traumatic repeat or it being held in the context of someone's healing. And maybe a different way of saying that is to frame the whole thing relationally. And the image that came to mind for me was all of us here today holding these lights, holding these beacons of hope and support across the whole journey. And some tangible examples of what these little beacons of lights might look like is, for example, more relational letter templates. This is what Petra said. She discussed the letter with me that she received recently, and it said the letter missed something about the courage it took to make the report. And was it possible to sustain that? That would be good, wouldn't it, to have that kind of language in the communication with our clients in the letters. And another example, two participants actually suggested starting support groups for people who have experienced historical abuse. And she talked about the history, of course, of the abuse, that it was in a context of isolation, of shame, of aloneness. And what flushes out shame is exposing the truth in a supportive environment. So these are just two ideas, but I'm sure between the, 800 of us, there will be lots of other beacons of light that we can add to that. Now, all participants urged us how important it was to slow down, to find our way of waiting, to not rush to do the paperwork, and to prioritize being present and taking time to navigate complex waters. And what really help with this, if somehow we can enshrine client readiness in law. So as counsellors, we don't feel like we're chancing it when we're doing the right thing by our clients. I want to finish with this quote from Lily. And I want to finish with this quote because when she said this to me, as a client who went through historical reporting, it really resonated with me. And it is how I felt with my counsellor. What she said to me was, the most important thing is that your client can remain with you in confidence. You are being strong and containing, and they understand you are going to be with them through it. And this holding that my counsellor did with me, I think is probably why for me it was ultimately a healing experience and not a re-traumatizing experience. And maybe as I've come to the end of this presentation, we can just all take a moment to think about what it would look like in your roles, to get your clients to understand that you are going to be with them through it. What words would you use? What gestures? How would they know? And maybe it's something you stop doing. Yeah. And maybe you want to share some of your thoughts in the chat room, or you can also email me with your reflections. My email address is marilyn@corkcounselingservices.ie. Thank you. I will stop sharing my slides now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marilyn, and thanks for ending that presentation with a reflective question for us to consider and bring back to our professional lives and professional contexts. I'm just going to hand over to Joe, who has a couple of words just before we kind of move into the Q&A session. So Joe, over to you.
Cheers, thanks, Fiacre, and really appreciate your help. I can't see myself, so hopefully you can see me on the screen. I am really grateful for your help this morning, Fiacre, and I'm really delighted. I have so many notes written here from the 5 speakers that we've had this morning. And I think it really covers the extent, I suppose, of the issue, but also the extent of the complexity that people face when they are impacted by sexual abuse, of negotiating systems, essentially, whether those be interpersonal systems or wider cultural and societal systems. And I'm just looking at some of the standout pieces for me of Jennifer speaking about this notion of historical abuse and almost this opt-out to be able to confine these experiences to history and not have to deal with them in the here and now. And I suppose we need to move away from that firmly and look at the fact that people are experiencing significant levels of trauma when they're trying to engage with systems to gain some sort of healing for themselves, but also to make sure that abuse is not perpetuated. We have Carol talking about that stigma in mediating the impact on those people that are affected and trying to come forward. And Neha talking about overall the complexity of disclosure and how this is represented through our arts and through our literature. I think it's really striking from Michelle, and it feeds into this wider systemic issue that the vast range of social predictors of sexual harassment they cover every aspect of our lives. And as Fiacre commented in the follow-up to that, it's just so pervasive, and it is in every aspect of people's day-to-day, so to speak, and predominantly females, obviously. Marilyn, I'm going to follow up with you all later on, but you've hit a lot of where my research is at and where it has been coming from and going to. And I'm struck by a comment when you said, when the law enters the counselling room, and I'm looking, you've given me a great phrase for it, and I'm going to steal it. I've just submitted a paper of when the law enters the social work conversation with people coming forward, and how we have what I'm equating to a machine of sorts, turning personal narratives and experiences into these public contexts of risk and risk assessment and forensics. And the adults predominantly that are coming forward, children as well, are getting lost in there. And that sitting with them and meeting that person where they're at is getting lost in this mechanism somewhere. And I think the overall phrase for me, or word for me, out of all the presentations here is systemic. And we're looking at a systemic issue. Jennifer, from the very off, said the research is saying the same things for the last number of decades, I would suggest. We're still here. So I'm hoping the conversation, I'm seeing some excellent questions coming in, and our speakers have been batting them away and responding to them really comprehensively. So I'm delighted with that. But we're going to, between myself and Fiacre now, just pose some questions. I'm conscious our break is coming up in 5 minutes. We might hold that till maybe 11:30 to give the Q&A some time. That will still give you 10 minutes to make a cup of tea, depending on how strong you want it, of course. And then we'll be back at 11:40. So I'm really going to open with a question for Jennifer, but I think it goes to the heart of what you're all talking about. It's a question posed by Maria Lotti on the Q&A. And she was asking Jennifer specifically, did you look at trauma of not having a safe person to disclose to, as well as the responses, potential negative responses to disclosure causing trauma? And this is such a serious issue across this system as we're talking about. So maybe Jennifer, if I can go to you first on that, and then we'll look at some other questions.
Yeah, so thanks, Maria, for this question. And really, the numbers of participants, I suppose, in a research project, if we look at it in those terms, like people that are prepared to sort of come on record with their experiences and to record them, when these women are coming through years and years of institutionalization in Magdalen laundries, the number is extremely low in comparison to the number that we assume are out there. So in terms of the kind of life history interviews that I conducted with the women, as well as similar projects with Justice for Magdalenes, the violence they would have experienced as a child is one part of their kind of life history interview. So we didn't delve into very, very directly, you know, who did you tell first? How did it go? And map it that way. It was much more, how did the person choose to sit that experience within talking about their life? So the questions were extremely open and not targeted towards pulling out a history of sexual abuse at all, but more, does the woman herself incorporate that into the narrative naturally? Is it part of what they talk about? So when they did disclose, and it was a common experience, unfortunately. This was not a one-off. This was the majority of the girls and women had some sort of violent sexual experience, either while institutionalized or before they were sent away from their families. So overwhelmingly, the responses were, I didn't tell anyone because the stigma and shame was so strong. When they left the Magdalen laundry, they were told, don't ever tell anyone you were here. You'll never get married. Nobody will ever give you a job, and so on. And it was unbelievably effective. So the majority of the time, no matter whether I'm talking to, you know, women of 18 or women of 70, I find I'm often the first disclosure. And it feeds into so much of what everyone is talking about here, that, you know, as researchers, we're not necessarily trained practitioners. We're not necessarily therapists, but we are in a very therapeutic-like setting in research. And it's that kind of holding the boundaries almost becomes very, very important. And I know I'm off on 10 tangents here. But I think in this sense, it was the case that The women didn't necessarily feel that their husband, child, friend wasn't safe. They simply weren't in a place to say those words and to create a narrative. They didn't have the ability to form the sentences, I think, around what had happened. And for many of them, that has happened much, much later in life. So I'm delighted to see that they're coming forward, but it's a serious lesson into how powerful stigma can be. So I don't know if I've kind of answered that directly enough, but I know we're caught for time, so I'll leave it there.
Absolutely, no, that's very much appreciated, Jennifer, and I think it does speak to that power of stigma, as Carol represented in the beginning of her presentation, and this pressure, this unseen pressure that is on victims and survivors of abuse to stay silent, and that's replicated, as we see from Marilene's presentation, but also Michelle's and the other presentations as well. It's replicated in various systems that individuals come into contact with. I do want to try and get through some. We do have a comment from Geraldine O'Sullivan talking about the fact that prior to mandatory reporting, social workers were able to advise counsellors to take their time and to hold that therapeutic space before arriving at an ultimate decision to come forward. And that this is now, there's some pressure. I myself would have been in support of mandatory reporting, but this is a somewhat unforeseen sort of interaction with our child protection policies as to how this is operating. So I think we really need to reconsider where we're at in terms of mandatory reporting and look at how best we can facilitate those coming forward and encourage them and support them when they are coming forward. Carol, I wanted to come to you because you had a question kind of directly into Niha's presentation around the reaction of audiences to this topic and to this literature and to these issues. I think it's a really important question, and maybe you'd like to pose it yourself to Niha.
Thanks very much, Joe. Yeah, I really enjoyed, well, fabulous morning, but specifically to Niha then, that you were talking about two pieces of work that I don't know, but I attended the production of Asking for It by Louise O'Neill in the Abbey. And at the end of it, my friend was sitting elsewhere in the auditorium, and a woman next to her, who was a complete stranger, turned to her and said, "I'm going home to report my rapist." And it was such a powerful collective experience. And I just wondered if Niha could reflect on that sort of how this information lands with audiences and what sort of impacts she thinks it can or does have.
Yeah, I'll talk about Getting Away with Murder first and then about Rathmines Road. So I saw Asking for It as well, and that was the first play that I saw in Ireland. So, and I do remember like there were a lot of intense audience reactions, like just gasp at like a sexist comment or anything. But Getting Away with Murder is predominantly like an urban Indian play, right? It has the lives of rural Indian women in the background. So, and it's being performed in
We may have had our first, maybe second technical glitch of the day. Apologies about that. Oh, we're back. Go.
Sorry. Sorry, did I break there? Can you
dropped out there for a second.
Okay, as I was saying, like it's an urban play. It was not very well received in India, first performed in Mumbai, but then it developed like a good scholarship, and that's how, you know, like people kind of started acknowledging the play. For Rathmines Road, on the other hand, the play was called very pessimistic. A few of the audience members were kind of they had to kind of seek redressal services that were available there, and they were seen in tears. And it also received a lot of criticism because it involved a trans person. And as per the critical response, it said that it was a digression. Whereas, you know, like when I read the play, it's not really a digression. It's just like 25 years after, when Sandra has returned to Ireland, she finds, as a rape survivor, she finds it very difficult to mediate around in Wicklow, as does her trans friend. So there is this, you know, like commonality of experience there that was entirely lost, I think, upon a lot of members within the audience. So I think that's what I understood the audience reactions predominantly to be. I hope that answered the question.
No, thanks very much, Leanne. Thanks for the presentation as well. I do want people to have a break. I'm conscious there are a lot of questions in the chat, but maybe if our participants can stay on and respond via text, if that's okay, because I do want to give people a break. I also want to just some housekeeping messages and some thank yous. That there's a couple of questions about the slides and content. For any of the panelists, some have shared already, that want to share their slides or any articles, I will make those available on the Irish Social Work blog, just because it's a way I can make them public, I suppose, and downloadable. And I'll be listening back to the recording myself. It won't be available straight away, but it should be available next week in segments of the various sections. So it's digestible. There's a lot here to take in. I think you'll admit and acknowledge. Somebody asked about CPD certification. We don't have accredited CPD, as in linked to the ISW or linked to legal CPD, for example, but we will be issuing certificates of attendance, and I know they're often accepted by various professional bodies in terms of CPD. We are operating on Twitter under the hashtag Disclosure Seminar. Nice and clunky, but it seems to be working so far. So anybody that's on Twitter, please feel free to get in behind that. The entire event and the report that's going to be launched after the coffee break are funded by the Irish Research Council and a new foundation's research grant and the UCD seed funding grant. So thank you very much to those for their support, and thank you again to Fiacre for chairing the first session, and you're going to please stick with us so we can pull the strings in the background here. Okay guys, listen, we'll be back in approximately 10 minutes, just at 20 to 12, and we'll open our next session then. And I just want to thank everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now and I will restart at 11:40. Thanks so much, everybody, for your presentations.
Thanks, everyone.